All right, guys, how's everyone doing? We are getting close, so these will be the last four. This is one of four. We're going to do two sets of questions for 66 to 70 and 71 through 77 because that's Reconstruction. That's the era after the Civil War, and you'll see when we get to 77 how it ends. But it's the period that was supposed to be rebuilding the country, hence the term Reconstruction. And from 65, 66 to 77, a lot of the focus is on that. But the other thing that you can see that I put here on this is I wanted you to realize that you also have during this time, sort of underneath it all, the growth of what's known as the Gilded Age, because once we get through this, you'll start to talk about, well, it'll be next year for US too, but you'll see Carnegie and Rockefeller and, Vanderbilt and Pullman, and all these guys that were the big, industrialists and on. You can see Rockefeller here. All right. And if you look, you can see all the business, Standard Oil, and you see he's got the White House in his hand. He's got the Capitol building with the smokestack. So you'll get into that more. But the reason I put this on the front instead of Reconstruction is because of the fact that you're going to wind up seeing the Gilded Age come out of this. All right. And when we talk about Grant, you'll even see some of the corruption that's occurring in the presidency because of the fact that you wind up with, business and politics starting to sort of combine. And, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of thing. And, the Gilded Age becomes this term, and this here is Mark Twain. And Mark Twain's the one who came up with the phrase the Gilded Age because he hated the idea that, these people did what they did and lived the way they did. But, just give you an example, and I always forget the guy's name because it's not like Rockefeller or Carnegie, but one of these guys had an entire ballroom, like where he would entertain people. Everything in it was made of gold. And that's what the Gilded Age is sort of referring to, the overdoing it of showing that you have money and, just people and their way of going about things. So you'll get into that. And again, I wanted to show you because I like to show, I want to make sure that you guys understand that when you get to it next year, it doesn't mean that it was separate from Reconstruction because it was happening at the same time. But our main focus will start to become Reconstruction because that's what, this area we're going to focus on is. So just, so you got Twain and Rockefeller, but that takes us into Reconstruction. And that's where we have to go next. There we go. All right, and you guys finished with the 1860 to 1864 to 1865. Sorry, that third part of the PowerPoint that you guys were supposed to create was the assassination of Lincoln. So what winds up happening is, hopefully, when we did the Constitution and we did the those things, that you guys remember the vice president takes over for the president after he has to leave office, or in this case is assassinated. So the vice president at the time was Andrew Johnson. All right, so Andrew Johnson becomes the president. And now here's the thing about what Lincoln does. If you remember with the Emancipation Proclamation and some other things, but we'll use the Emancipation Proclamation as our example. Lincoln showed that he was a good politician in the sense that he tried to keep the people who were on his side staying on his side, because he said only the slaves in states that were in rebellion were free, because he didn't want to lose, the border states like Missouri, who had stayed with the Union. He wanted to keep them. So, and again, to try and get some support from those border states in 1864 during that election, what he does is he appoints Andrew Johnson, or names Andrew Johnson, I should say, his vice presidential candidate. And so Andrew Johnson comes in, and you can see on the slide that he's from Tennessee. And, you see the other stuff about the Southern senator not to join the Confederacy. And that in alone is what, is a big draw to put him in, because again, you'll get these border states to support them. These sort of pro-slavery people who are still part of the Union might lean a little toward the fact that you have Andrew Johnson, pro-Southern, if they're not necessarily pro-slave. So he comes in. The problem is you wind up with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and you get a whole change here. And you can see that it says on there that he was, contradictory in his approach to slavery. He didn't really give an answer. But what you wind up with is Andrew Johnson was racist. And so you go from Abraham Lincoln to a president now who is racist. And quite honestly, Andrew Johnson was, and one of the reasons he stayed with the Union and didn't go with the Confederacy is because he was a small farmer. And he actually, because he was a small farmer, didn't have many slaves, if any, because he was, they were poor. These small farmers in the South were poor. That's the middle, border states there. A lot of those farmers were not big, wealthy plantation owners like the cotton industry provided in the Deep South. And Andrew Johnson, when he comes into office, he actually, instead of worrying about the slave issue and all that because of his racism and those beliefs that he had with that, his target was more the fact that he wanted to actually attack the rich plantation owners and try and make a better South for the smaller farmers. So his focus was different. And when he talked about punishing anybody, it was those big plantation owners. So they really became the target for Andrew Johnson because he was, upset about that. So, and you can see some of the other things, and we're going to get to the radical Republicans shortly. And so you'll see that in a couple slides again. All right. And you can see in the quote too, I've lived among Negroes all my life, and I am for this government with slavery under the Constitution as it is. And that's a quote from Andrew Johnson from before, so you get an idea of where he stood. Okay. Moving on, the other thing that you wind up with is in the South and trying to deal with the fact that these rules and laws were put in place and how to address it. And you can see down at the bottom there, the idea of one of the laws that Mississippi had, all right, and it's an excerpt, not a quote, but you can see the excerpt from their laws there. And the black codes were an extension of the slave codes. It's just they're not slaves anymore in the case of all these freed slaves that are now saying, what the hell am I going to do next? And that's a big question here during Reconstruction. How are you going to rebuild the South physically? Because the buildings have been destroyed in a lot of cases. Richmond was like laying in ruins. You wind up with, Sherman's March to the Sea and all the destruction he did. You got to rebuild that. Crops were destroyed. You have to redo all that. You have to rebuild it in a sense politically, because how is it going to fit back into the new United States after the Civil War? But also, what's going to happen to several million people who are now free, but where the heck do they go? Right. And you see that the South, they were still in that idea of trying to keep these freed slaves under their thumb. And you see these types of codes that were put in place and some of the restrictions that they placed on them as you read through the slide here. And there was, I'm just giving you an example. There was a ton of restrictions throughout the different Southern states. And mainly in the Cotton Belt, but again, those black, and you can see the fact that in some cases you couldn't go out if you were African American during certain times of the day or night, or if you were out, you had to have a pass, like a hall pass almost, to say that you were allowed to be outside, out of your home and walking the streets. So, it's a tough time, even though slavery is over, right? It's, and that's the struggle of Reconstruction. And there's a lot of failures to Reconstruction, but when we get to the end, after part 4 of this, you'll see that one of the biggest failures of Reconstruction was to really address the issue of those freed slaves, right? And we'll talk about some of that down the road too. So with that being said, see if I can move on here for you. Oh, Okay. So then you winds up with these ideas from people and how they wanted to try and make things better. And again, the people who were out to help these ex-slaves and to try and get the ex-slaves into a better position were fighting an uphill battle because, again, remember too, and let's not forget this, the North, those northern states weren't sitting there with their doors wide open saying, hey, instead of staying down there, come up to us. Because if they come up to New York or New Jersey or to, Massachusetts or wherever, Illinois, if they start to come into those different cities and towns there, what they're going to do is you're going to have several million people coming in who need jobs. And the people who live there already don't want them to take their jobs. So that's where you don't have this, oh, come on up here. Right. So what you start to see is some different ideas that are put out there and some different things that are set up to try and help the ex-slaves. And William Tecumseh Sherman, same guy who marched across the South and into, through Atlanta and to the coast of Savannah and all that. He was about taking the 40 acres and a mule thing to give those slaves ex-slaves, a chance to get started in their new lives with a tract of land and a mule, because it's important to have livestock and to help move things and all that, and to get started that way and take those 40 acres, because again, it's how much are you going to punish the plantation owners, the people who started this Civil War in the minds of the victors, the Union. All right. When you win, you get to decide who started it. And so William Sherman was saying, we take that land from those guys and we give them to the slaves so they have a tract of land. So we're sort of punishing them, getting these people who are now floating basically in the air saying, what do we do? A place to go and start to, make some money and, be able to live an independent life now and all that kind of stuff. Right. It doesn't go because the South pushes back. Right. The South pushes back. Even the Freedmen's Bureau that you see there, and you can see the different things that they tried to help with. And you can see that places like Howard University even come out of that because, the Freedmen's Bureau sets it up to try and help these freed slaves and, freed African Americans that weren't necessarily slaves. But the main focus was the freed slaves to get an education, right, to help them better themselves and to be able to, fit in and make a living in society at the time. So that's what they're looking for. All right. And you can see, though, that Andrew Johnson is against this. And that's the tough part. And that's where the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is certainly a vital piece of this, because if Lincoln had survived, this would have been different. Who knows how different or which way it would have gone, but it would have been different because Lincoln was definitely different than Andrew Johnson. Okay. And that's one of the aspects of all this that you have to see. All right. And you got the different things that the Freedmen's Bureau helped with. All right. So the Freedmen's Bureau was put in place and eventually it will go away. But it's you have millions of people who are now free but don't know what to do. And you can see the different things as far as the former slaves can get, finding jobs for them. I'm going to get to this eventually again, but I think it, bears repeating, because what's going to wind up happening, and I think I need to say this now, is that in the long run, a lot of these ex-slaves are going to wind up working for white plantation owners in a lot of cases, on the exact same land that they were slaves on. And in journals and interviews and stuff like that, when people would talk to some of these ex-slaves, they even would say to the people that were talking to them, slavery was better than this, because at least we were guaranteed somewhere to go and live, and we could grow gardens, and because at this point, they were getting paid almost nothing and they had to still survive. So it was a difficult time. Okay. So that takes us to the fact that you did have these people, and for a time period, it did look like they might be heading in a positive direction. But I mentioned earlier, the radical Republicans, and you see Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner's picture here, right there and there. And those two were, members of this radical Republican group who were all about the idea of, punishing the South. Even before Lincoln was assassinated, you wound up with a situation where, if you look on the slide, Lincoln wanted to have where 10% of the free white males had to now pledge loyalty to the Union before they would be allowed back in as a full participating state. All right, so 10% of the free white male population would have to pledge loyalty. You see here, the radical Republicans passed the Wade Davis bill. They wanted majority is 51% of the white males pledge. So you can see, even before Lincoln was assassinated, there was some conflict there, all right, because they wanted now. Andrew Johnson totally doesn't care about that part of it. All right, he's in a totally different aspect, but what winds up happening is, for the first 3, 4, maybe 5 years or so of Reconstruction, the radical Republicans are able to establish, organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau. They're able to pass, as you can see on there, this like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments will come out of the efforts of the radical Republicans and others, but they are going to be part of, mainly the 14th and 15th. The 13th was also a lot of Lincoln, with the making sure that the war ended slavery with the Union victory. And you can see on the slide, even there, though, that the 14th Amendment eventually comes out of the idea of what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is, and it talks about allowing African Americans to be citizens under the Constitution, right? And that people are now, even though they're ex-slaves or whatever, they are citizens. So you wind up with that. You can even see there that Andrew Johnson vetoes it. They overturn it. The most overturned vetoes are during this time of any one presidency. You also have the Reconstruction Acts, right? And that takes us to another, and you can see where the radical Republicans definitely were in control at this point, because the Reconstruction Acts are a pretty aggressive step, and you wind up with the radical Republicans versus Andrew Johnson. And, I think one of the things that will start the downfall of the radical Republicans, we'll get to in a minute, but this battle is taking place, and the radical Republicans are having some success, even though Johnson keeps fighting back in terms of the veto. And, eventually the Freedmen's Bureau is, ended because of Johnson's efforts. But with the Reconstruction Acts, you see the radical Republicans, and you can read what it says here. And you can see also a step toward the 15th Amendment, adult male suffrage. That means all males, no matter what color they were allowed to actually vote. So that's, again, a step toward the 15th Amendment. But here, before the 15th Amendment is passed, what the radical Republicans did was they separated the South into military districts. And you wound up they stationed troops. It was under martial law. And you can see that there were 5 districts, and you can see the generals over here that were in charge of the troops and of the area, and they enforced things. And that was huge. The Freedmen's Bureau was able to do some things in the South because of that. When we get forward and we end today with some of the hate groups that formed when these military districts were formed, the military's presence helped sort of keep it sort of contained, not totally, but once they leave, it's open season, and it becomes just a total shit show for people in the South, mainly freed African Americans in the South. So, and that's for more stuff that we'll talk about down the road. But you see the military districts and the separation here, and this shows you that big step because of what you're talking about with martial law. And it does give it gives a sign, a symbol, whatever word you want to use, of what could be. But what's also going to happen is, as the radical Republicans start to lose power and these military districts are eventually taken away, it'll be the failure to actually achieve what the goals were. Because the 14th and 15th Amendments, even though it says citizenship and the right to vote for all males, that won't be something that actually happens, even though it's supposed to be protected under the Constitution. Right? And you'll see some of that as well as we move forward. Okay. So the Reconstruction Acts are that big step because, again, it's that military presence that helps to keep some semblance of control and start to establish some, you'll get, and we'll talk about this again, you'll get some of the first African Americans to actually serve in Congress down in the South and in some of the, local and state governments. But once this ends, those people are kicked out. So you'll see that. Now, this is where Andrew Johnson's power will be sort of that he'll lose power. Let's put it this way. Andrew Johnson will become a lame duck before the election even comes up. But also the radical Republicans will take a hit with the public here. And Andrew Johnson's fall from power is a lot quicker. And the election's coming up, so that helps too. But the radical Republicans, it's a little slower, I guess is the best way to put it, because with the radical Republicans, they still have a presence. It's just what they do here is and again, you can see what they're arguing. Again, that quote at the top is from Andrew Johnson. Again, this is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men. So you can see, even as president, he's making statements like that, and that's not what the radical Republicans believe in. So you can see that Tenure of Office Act basically is setting up the president. And they know that the radical Republicans know that, Johnson wants to fire Edwin Stanton. They say, no, you can't. Not under the Tenure of Office Act. You're not allowed to do that without Senate approval, as you can see in this bullet point here. Andrew Johnson, and this should sound a little familiar as far as a president taking a stand and, not listening to people and all that. I mean, there's some similarities here in the way that it's approached. So you can see, and Andrew Johnson fires Edwin Stanton. So remember, impeachment is not removing someone from office. The House of Representatives, when they impeached Andrew Johnson, they brought charges against him. Right? They brought charges against him, and the charges were for violating the Tenure of Office Act. And what happens at this point is people, look at Andrew Johnson and they're like, oh my God. But they're also looking at Congress and even some of the members of Congress themselves. You can see here that whole system of checks and balances. Congress blocks this decision from going to the Supreme Court to make a ruling. Right. So sometimes the system of checks and balances gets a little, wonky here as far as the fact that that's allowed to happen. Right. But it's usually in times of extreme distress or, rebuilding in this case. And, so that it's allowed to happen and sort of they sneak it through, if you will. And then what happens is that a lot of the public starts to question what's going on, and it sort of starts to get to the conscience of the Congress themselves. And you can see it down at the bottom bullet point here that when it comes time, because after the House of Representatives brings charges or impeaches the president, it goes to the Senate to actually remove them from office. That's the trial. And you can see that they failed to convict by one vote. So it was still close. But even, it definitely went, some of the people who they thought would actually vote to remove him from office didn't, and there was some questioning of that. Now, again, remember, just because that happened, though, afterward, Andrew Johnson's power is pretty much done. Right? He's out, and he fills out the rest of his office, getting most of his vetoes overturned, and not having really much of a presence as far as a president. So that takes us to 1868. And you see that Ulysses S. Grant will win this election, all right? And you can see that he wins over Horatio Seymour, so it's not even like you're winding up with Andrew Johnson even running again. So you can see what the effect there was. If you look at the map, you can see that there's still a few states that are not voting yet, all right? But you can see the breakdown there of how these votes went. And remember, because of those Reconstruction Acts, you still have a decent amount of those freed slaves, the African Americans, voting. So that's why you do see not just all one color down here in the Deep South. It is that influence of that, and that's part of this election. And so you can see that Grant actually gets some votes down in these southern states, and that has a lot to do with it. So Grant is now the president of the United States, which we will look at here, right? And when it comes to Grant, we'll talk about him a little bit more down the road too, because um, you know, it was a situation where with Grant, his presidency is going to be not a very strong 8 years. And part of he won't be as bad as Andrew Johnson. And you can see here that, people were saying that you have to get the South back into the United States quicker. They have to become full members. We have to get sort of moving on as a country. And you see what Grant says, though. Grant makes the stand that if we do it too quick, the Civil War didn't mean anything. All those people that died, all that, destruction and death and all that horrible stuff that happened would have meant nothing if we just say, okay, you're welcome back in. Okay, there's no slavery, but do what you want, And granted, that happens sort of anyway, but at the time, Grant's hoping it won't. And that's where he's trying to make that stand. And he's trying to, but Andrew Johnson was a racist who was more worried about the big plantation owners than anything else. But the problem for Ulysses S. Grant was he trusted his friends too much. He let them get away with some stuff that we'll talk about down the road. He has one of the top 5 corrupt presidencies of all time. I'd have to really think hard and see if maybe even top 3 or so, but top 5. And that really messes things up. And it's also, there's going to be a financial crisis combined with that corruption that really will hurt Grant's presidency and lead to the end of Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction. But at the time when Grant comes into office, he answers his critics by saying, we need to move forward, but we need to make sure that the sacrifice was for something. And that's why he's talking about what they need to do with the idea of bringing the South back in, and if it was done too quickly. All right. So that takes us also now during this time. All right. You have these two definitions, honestly. Scalawags, you can read through and you can see that, I put this in because you definitely want to make sure that you realize that just not all Northerners just felt the same way, and not all Southerners just felt the same way. You can see here that there were Southerners who were in favor of Reconstruction, and they were fine with what the Civil Rights Act and eventually the 14th and 15th Amendment said, and they felt fine with the idea of what was happening as far as, what the radical Republicans, or maybe not quite as far as them, but at least somewhere along the same lines, they were fine with this. And, you also had the carpetbaggers, and that's this picture down here. It's a bag where people would just throw their belongings in, and then you see down here heading down south, right? And you can see Northerners would head down south because whenever something like this happens, you have people who want to try and take advantage of the situation. Now, when I say take advantage of the situation, carpetbaggers were sometimes positive, and we're going down to join the Freedmen's Bureau. They would head down and try to help out. Think about the civil rights movement and the freedom buses and all that, and the people who would come from the north down to the south to, go to, Montgomery, Alabama or Arkansas. There were more people than not in that case were helping. Right, carpetbaggers. Some of these carpetbaggers would go down and try and help and get things rolling, to get the economy going, find ways to get the South rolling. Others would go down and take advantage. There were others that would go down and just try and, take advantage of a weak economy, see if they could make themselves rich during that time, and definitely it was not a positive, because it was more about how can I get rich off of these people who are in a desperate situation, and then that way I can take advantage of it for myself. Okay, so you have the positive and negative of the carpetbaggers. Again, that's more of a simple definition. The last thing today, what we're going to do is finish with this and these last 2 slides, because you see the Confederate reaction, in this situation. If you read there, worst in slavery, you see this guy, the White League, and then the Ku Klux Klan, right? And you had others that were, formed during this time as far as hate groups are concerned. The Ku Klux Klan becomes the main one, whatever the the one that unfortunately winds up with a decent amount of power during the period of Reconstruction. And then again in the 1920s, really, it comes back even more powerful. It's lost a lot of its power, but you can see that, these hate groups, and yes, a big focus of these hate groups were definitely the freed slaves, African Americans. But it was also a focus on, you wind up with Catholics, you wind up with the Republicans. For a while in the Reconstruction period, it was African Americans. And if you were a known Republican, you could be also a target of Klan violence, and that's where they started. Nathan Forrest, who was the first Grand Wizard, one of the things that they started off with was almost more like a club of people who were sort of just sitting there, since they were ex-Confederate soldiers and leaders, they were just like, commiserating, saying how much it sucked that they lost and sort of reliving the days of the war and bitching about things. But then it turned into what you see like with that last bullet point, and the idea that, you know what, let's start taking back the South. The South will rise again. Those types of things that you've heard in the past and all as well. And unfortunately, like I said, they have these different peaks of power, and you wind up, getting that. But it's this sort of revenge for the Civil War. It's to try and reclaim the South. And even though they're going to be part of the United States, they're gonna still, even though there won't be slavery, they're still going to run the politics and all their way. And that's why, that's where these hate groups come from. And they're trying to reestablish some semblance of Southern power. And that's what happens, and also take some revenge. Okay. That's it for today. Well, for this one, whatever. I don't know today. And then I'll be doing a second one at some point. This one will be due Wednesday, which is May 20th. Yeah. We have that Friday off of Memorial Day, so this will be May 20th, and then you'll have one more due May 21st, and you'll have those questions. And also when you see the extra credit, the secret word is you will all be juniors soon. All right, junior. Well, some of you are going to be seniors, I know. Sorry, but juniors. Junior is the secret word. It's just so you make sure you watch this.